The pry bar caught on the third nail, and the board came away from the depot door with a sound like a held breath finally let go. Tamsin Lowell stood on the warped platform in the last gray light of a winter afternoon, the cold of the high desert pressing through her shawl, and looked into a room no living person had entered in 19 years. Dust hung in the slot of light she had opened. The smell that rolled out was of old iron, of paper gone soft, of a fire long dead in a stove no one had cleaned. Somewhere inside, faint and impossible, a clock was still ticking. She did not move at first. She had paid $4 for this building at the county tax sale, $4, and the laughter of men who thought she had bought herself a coffin with a roof. Now she heard the ticking and felt the small hairs rise along her arms. A clock that ran without a keeper for 19 years was not a clock. It was a question. And Tamsin had come to Antler Gap with nothing but a satchel of files and gravers and the patience to answer questions other people had given up on. She would not understand for several more days that the ticking was a lie someone had arranged on purpose, or that the answer to it would unbury 7 names a powerful man had spent 2 decades keeping in the ground. To understand how a woman of 29 came to own a boarded train depot on a dead spur line, you have to go back to the man who taught her the trade and to the territory that had forgotten them both. Antler Gap sat at the upper end of the desolation territory, where the sage gave out against red rimrock, and the wind came down the long valley with nothing to slow it. Once a branch line had climbed to it, a narrow spur off the main road of the Cortege and Western, built in a season of optimism to serve a silver strike that played out in 3 years. When the ore failed, the company pulled the rails from the upper grade and let the lower track rust, and the town that had risen to 1,100 souls fell to 90. The depot stood at the head of the dead spur like a tooth in an empty jaw, boarded, condemned, and entered in the county rolls as worthless. Tamsin had not been born there. She had come up from the river country to the south, the only child of a woman who took in mending, and a father who drove freight until a wagon brake failed on the Lawston grade and ended him. At 11, she was apprenticed, not to a milliner or a household as girls of her station usually were, but to the one man in 200 miles who would take a girl into a precise and difficult trade because he had no son and no patience for the opinion of the town. His name was Obed Strawn, and he was the station master at a junction 40 miles south called Hollow Tine Crossing, and he kept the time. That phrase meant more on the frontier than it means now. On a single-track railroad, where 2 trains running toward each other on the same iron meant death by the dozen, everything turned on time. The station master received the train orders by telegraph, copied them in a clear hand, and handed them up to the engineers on a hooped stick as the train slowed through. He set his clock by the noon signal, flashed down the wire from the division office, and every order he wrote carried a time, and the lives of everyone aboard hung on those times being true. Obed Strawn had kept the time at Hollow Tine Crossing for 31 years. And in all that span, he had not lost a train, nor a passenger, nor an hour. He taught her the clock first. A railroad regulator, he told her, was the most honest object a person could own, because it could not flatter you, and it could not lie to you. And if it ran fast or slow, it told you so by the only language it had, which was the position of its hands against the sun. He taught her to clean a movement without scratching the plates, to true a balance wheel, to file a worn pivot back to round, to read the tiny script of wear that a mechanism wrote upon itself over years. He taught her that the escapement was the conscience of the clock, the part that let time out, measured tooth at a time, and that a clock with a sound conscience would keep faith with you long after you were dead. He taught her the ledger second. Every station kept one, a great bound book in which the master entered the freight received and forwarded, the passengers up and down the express boxes signed for, the dead and missing. That last column was the one Obed cared for most. A railroad, he said, was a river of things and people moving in the dark, and now and again the river swallowed something, a crate that left one station and never reached the next, a strong box short by its seal, a man whose ticket was punched at the upper end of the line who simply did not get off at the lower. Most masters let the missing column fill and forgot it. Obed Strawn filled it and remembered, because he believed that a thing recorded was a thing that could one day be found, and that the keeping of an honest account was a kind of slow justice that waited for its hour. What Tamsin did not know, in the years she stood at his elbow learning to read the wear on a pivot, and the meaning of an unbalanced column, was that Obed Strawn had once kept the time at Antler Gap, and had left it under a shadow that he never spoke of, and that the missing column in his last ledger there held the heaviest entry of his life. He died in the autumn of her 28th year. He had been failing through the summer, his hands no longer steady enough to true a balance, and he had given the clockwork over to her by then and sat by the stove and watched her work. Near the end he called her close and pressed into her palm a brass depot key, worn smooth as a river stone, and a folded slip of paper, and he told her two things in a voice gone to gravel. The first was that the depot at Antler Gap would come up for sale when the county finally moved on its back taxes, and that she was to buy it however little it cost, and that she was not to ask the town's leave. The second was that the regulator clock still hung on the wall inside, and that she was to clean it and to read the ledger by it, and that when the clock in the book agreed she would understand what he had carried for 19 years and could not set down. She asked him what she would find. He said only that she would find the missing. Then he closed his eyes, and the next morning his clock at Hollowtine Crossing was the only thing in the room still moving. She buried him on a rise above the crossing where he could hear the trains, and she settled his small affairs, and through the winter she made the regulators and pocket watches of 3 counties keep honest time, because that was the trade he had left her, and a woman alone must eat. And in the spring, as he had foretold, a notice went up that the condemned depot building at Antler Gap, together with the strip of dead right-of-way it stood upon, would be sold at the courthouse door for the satisfaction of 19 years of unpaid territorial tax. She rode the 2 days north with her satchel of tools and the brass key in her pocket, and stood at the back of a small crowd of men who had come to buy the rusting rail iron for scrap and the platform timbers for barns. No one wanted the building. The auctioneer, a fat and genial man named Harlow Pike, made his joke when her bid of $4 went unanswered. She had bought herself a roof over nothing, he said, and now she might explain to the company how she meant to move it. The men laughed, the way men will laugh at a thing they do not understand to make it smaller. Tamsin took the deed and folded it once and put it away and said that she would manage. It was the most she had said all morning. She did not move the building. She moved into it. The first board came off the door that gray afternoon, and the rest came off over the following hour. As the light failed, and she made no fire that first night, but sat in the cold with a lantern and let the depot show itself to her slowly, the way a clock shows itself when you take off the dust cover and let your eyes adjust to the dim glint of brass. It was all there. That was the strangeness of it. 19 years boarded, and the room was as the last man had left it. The green-shaded lamp on the desk, the telegraph key under its little glass bell, the order hoops on their pegs, the high bookkeeper's stool, and on the wall behind the desk, ticking, the regulator clock. It hung in a tall walnut case with a glass door, its long pendulum swinging in steady, measured strokes, its hands standing at a time that was 20 minutes wrong by the watch in her pocket. A clock left running by a man who knew his trade did not lose 20 minutes in a night, and it did not run at all for 19 years on a single winding. Someone had been here. Someone came and wound it. That was the first thread, and she felt it pull. She found the ledger the next morning. In the iron-bound desk drawer, a great book bound in cracked black leather with the years stamped on the spine, and she lifted it out and set it on the desk and did not open it. She was to read it by the clock. When the two agreed, the clock did not yet agree with anything. So she set the book aside and turned to the work, and the work was the clock. She took the movement down with care that bordered on tenderness. A railroad regulator is a serious mechanism, weight-driven deadbeat escapement, a movement built to be more honest than the men who wind it, and this one was old and very fine and very dirty. She cleaned the plates and the pivots. She found, as she had half expected, the reason it ran slow and lied by 20 minutes. Someone with no skill had been keeping it alive. The mainspring of a regulator is no spring at all, but a falling weight, and the weight had been let down and crudely rewound by a hand that did not know to ease the click. And in the doing, the third pivot had been bent a hair out of true, so that the clock dragged and lost time and would have stopped within the year. Whoever wound it knew enough to keep it ticking, and not enough to keep it honest. She trued the pivot. She cleaned the escapement, the conscience of the clock, and found one tooth of the escape wheel slightly burred, and she stoned it smooth. She oiled what wanted oil and left dry what wanted to stay dry. And on the third day, she hung the weight and set the pendulum swinging, and stood back, and the regulator took up its stroke with the even, unhurried, incorruptible beat of a mechanism doing the one thing it was made to do. Then she set it, not by her pocket watch, which kept river country time, but by the noon sun. With a meridian line she scratched on the south sill and a plumb bob, the old way Obed had taught her, the way a stationmaster set his clock when the wire was down. When the shadow crossed the line, she stopped the pendulum, moved the hands to noon, and started it again. And for the first time in 19 years, the regulator at Antler Gap told the truth. She opened the ledger that night. It was Obed Strawn's hand, the same clear, upright script she had read 10,000 times, in train orders and repair tickets, and seeing it there in the lamplight in this dead room was like hearing his voice come up out of the floor. The book ran from the spring of the depot's first year to a date in the autumn, 19 years gone, and then it stopped. The freight column, the passenger column, the express column, all of it, the ordinary traffic of a small mountain station, entered day by day in his patient hand. And the last column, the missing, ran nearly empty for years. A crate here, a trunk there, the small losses of any line, each one entered and most of them later marked, recovered in a different ink, until the final pages. There the missing column filled. The last entries clustered in a single week of that final autumn, and they were not crates and trunks. They were a strongbox of the cordage and Western, a company payroll box, $11,000 in coin and notes consigned from the division office at the lower end of the line to the mine office at Antler Gap to pay off the Silver Crew when the strike closed. The box had been put aboard the down train at the division office under seal. It had never reached Antler Gap, and beneath that entry in Obed's hand were 7 more lines in the missing column, and they were not freight at all. They were men, 7 names, a section crew, the gang that maintained the upper grade, entered as missing. On the same date, the box went short, with a single notation beside them that turned Tamsen's hands to ice, charged with the loss. Discharged, whereabouts unknown. She sat a long time over those 7 names, She knew none of them. They were frontier names, plain and short, the names of men who swung mauls and set ties and lined rail for $1 a day. And beside each one, Obed had written the same 3 words, and the 3 words were an accusation that had cost 7 men their livelihoods. And Obed Strawn had recorded it, and then, she saw, had not let it lie. For under the 7 names, in a hand that had grown smaller and more careful, as a man writes when he means a thing to last, were 3 further lines. The box left the division office sealed. The seal that reached the inquiry was sound. The down train ran on a time it could not have run. She did not understand the 3rd line. The first 2 she grasped at once. A strong box shipped under seal, arriving short, meant either that it had been opened and resealed by someone with the means to forge a company seal, or that it had never carried the money at all, and the seal told a true story about a lie. The 3rd line, though the down train ran on a time it could not have run, was a clockmaker's sentence, and Obed had left it for a clockmaker to read, and he had told her she would understand it when the clock in the book agreed. The clock now told the truth. She had only to make the book tell hers. She turned back through the ledger to the days around the loss, and she read every train order Obed had copied into the margins in those final weeks, because a careful master kept his orders, and Obed had been the most careful master the line ever had. Train orders carried times. The time a train was due, the time it cleared, the time it was given the road against an opposing movement. And as Tamsin laid the orders of that final autumn side by side and read them by the honest beat of the regulator she had just made honest, she began to see the shape of the lie that a powerful man had built, and that an old stationmaster had spent 19 years unable to tear down alone. The payroll box had been consigned on the down train of a Thursday. The order showed the down train cleared the division office at the lower end at 1:30 in the afternoon, and was due at Antler Gap, 40 miles and a hard grade away, at 6. Below that order sat a second one, issued from the division office over the superintendent's own initials, that held the down train 2 hours at a passing track called Sable Tank to let a special move up ahead of it. And there was the master's notation, in Obed's hand, that the down train had nonetheless arrived at Antler Gap at 6 o'clock sharp on its original card, as though the 2-hour hold had never happened. A train cannot run a hard mountain grade in 2 hours less than the grade allows. The schedule was the schedule, because the locomotive could do no better. If the order held the train 2 hours and the train still arrived on time, then one of 2 things was true. Either the order to hold was never delivered and the train ran straight through on its card, or the order was delivered, the train was held, and someone afterward altered the record to erase the gap. And the man whose initials were on the holding order, the man who alone could issue it and alone could later cause the record to be altered, was the division superintendent of the Cordage and Western, a man named Calder Voss. Tamsin sat back. Outside, the wind worked at the boards she had not yet pried loose, and the regulator counted off the seconds in the cold. And she understood that she was holding the corner of something very large. You have perhaps known a thing in your own life that everyone agreed to forget because remembering it cost too much. Hold that feeling a moment, because she held it too, alone in a dead depot with a dead man's book. Then she went back to the page. She needed to know which it was, whether the train had run through on its card or been held and the record scrubbed. The ledger could not tell her that alone. For that she needed someone who had been on the grade that autumn, 19 years before, and was still alive to say so. The town gave her nothing at first. Antler Gap had 90 souls, and they regarded the woman who had bought the boarded depot the way a town regards a person who disturbs a settled grave. She went among them carefully, buying flour and lamp oil at the one store, asking small questions, mending a regulator clock for the storekeeper to make herself useful and known. She did not say what she had found. She asked gently who had been here in the old days, who remembered the spur when it ran, who had worked the upper grade. It was the storekeeper's wife, a spare gray woman named Verbena Quist, who finally set down the bolt of cloth she was folding and looked at Tamsin a long moment and said that if she wanted to know about the old days, she should ride out to the Sable Tank Road and find Decker. Old Decker had been a section hand on the upper grade before the strike closed. The woman said he lived alone now in a half-dugout with a mule and would talk to no one, but he had been here, and he had reason to remember. Tamsin asked why. Because his brother, the woman said, was one of the 7 they ran off for the payroll, and she would say no more and turned back to her cloth. But she had said enough. Tamsin rode out the next morning. The Sable Tank Road was a faint trace through the sage, and the dugout was cut into the south face of a low rise, smoke standing straight up from its pipe in the still cold. A man came to the door before she reached it, old and bent and watchful, a man who had spent his life out of doors and trusted none of it. He did not ask her in. He stood with his hand on the doorframe and let her say her piece in the cold, and she said it plainly that she had bought the depot, that she had cleaned the clock and read the stationmaster's ledger, and that the ledger named 7 men charged with a loss she did not believe they took. The old man's face did not change for a long moment. Then he said one word, his brother's name, and his voice broke on it after 19 years, and he stepped back from the door and let her in. What he told her, over a fire of sage roots in the dim dugout, filled the gap the ledger could not. The dugout was a single low room cut into the hillside, a dirt floor swept hard as fired clay, a plank bunk, a few tools hung on pegs of antler, and the mule breathing in a lean-to through the back wall. He set a tin cup of bitter coffee in her hands without asking and lowered himself onto a nail keg across the small fire. And for a while he said nothing, his eyes on the flames, a man deciding whether to open a thing he had kept shut for 19 years to a stranger in a red shawl. Then he began, and once he began, he did not stop. His brother and the 6 others had been the upper section crew camped at Sable Tank that autumn to relay the rotten ties on the worst of the grade. They had been good men, he said, plain men who knew rail, men who lined and tamped and set ties for $1 a day and slept under a tarp by the passing track and asked nothing of anyone. He named them as he spoke, slowly, the way a man tells over a row of graves, and Tamsin did not write the names down because she saw that he needed to say them more than she needed the paper, and that they were already written, in a clear upright hand, in a book back at the depot. On the Thursday the payroll came up, he said the down train had not stopped at Sable Tank at all, nor been held there. He remembered it the way a man remembers the day his life turned, in pieces sharper than the days around it. The crew had been eating their noon meal off the track when they heard her coming down the grade, and they had stood off into the sage to let her pass, and his brother had taken out the brass-cased watch their father had left him and timed her against the sun and their own dinner hour, out of nothing but the habit of men who live by a schedule. She had come through on her card, he said, never slowing, the stack talking steady, the express messenger riding the head end with the strong box plain to see, and gone on up the grade toward Antler Gap on her proper time. No, hold. No 2 hours. No stop at the tank. The train ran straight through, and his brother had put the watch back in his pocket and said she was running honest. And 3 days later, the company said his brother was a thief. And 3 days later, the company men had come up the grade with papers and a deputy and told the 7 of them that the box had reached Antler Gap short, $11,000 gone from under a sound seal, and that since no one along the line could have reached a sealed box on a moving train except the men who worked the grate across, they were discharged and would answer for the theft. There had been no proof and no trial, only the company's word and the deputy's badge, and 7 men with no money and no standing had been driven off the line and out of the territory with the name of thief hung on them. His brother had gone south to look for work that the name followed and spoiled, and had died in a flood camp on the lower river within 2 years, and the old man had never been able to lift the lie off him because it was the company's word against a dead section hands, and the company was Calder Voss. Tamsin asked him the question that mattered. Had anyone written down that the train ran through on time and was never held? Was there any record but his memory? The old man laughed, without any humor in it. The records were the company's, he said. The superintendent's office made the records. A section hand's memory was not a record. That was the whole of it. The men who kept the paper had decided what the paper said, and the paper said his brother was a thief. There was a record, though. Tamsin knew there was because she had it. Obed Strawn had copied every order into his ledger and noted the train's true arrival, and his note said the down train had arrived at 6 o'clock on its card, which agreed exactly with the old man's memory of a train that ran straight through and was never held. The holding order existed on paper over Voss's initials. The train's true running in the master's honest hand said the holding order had never been obeyed, because it had never truly been issued to be obeyed. It had been created afterward, slid into the file to manufacture a 2-hour window in which the box could have been opened on a stopped train by the men camped beside it. A window that never existed. A crime against 7 men built out of a forged order and a scrubbed schedule by a man who controlled the paper and believed no one would ever read the time. She understood at last the third line Obed had left her. The down train ran on a time it could not have run. He had meant that the time on the holding order and the time on the arrival could not both be true, that the paper contradicted itself by 2 clock hours, and that the contradiction was the fingerprint of the man who made it. He had seen it 19 years ago. He had not been able to prove the order was false, because he had only his own copies against the company's originals, and a station master's word, like a section hand's, weighed nothing against a superintendent's. He had been the master at Antler Gap that autumn. He had refused to sign the inquiry's finding against the 7 men, and for that refusal, Calder Voss had broken him too, transferred him down to the obscure junction at Hollow Tine Crossing, and let it be understood that he had been moved for cause. And Obed Strawn had carried the unfinished account south and kept the time at a forgotten crossing for the rest of his life, waiting for a hand that could finish what his could not. He had given that hand a clock to make honest and a book to read by. A copied order and an old man's memory, even so, were still not proof a court would hear. Tamsin needed the originals. She needed the holding order itself, the false one, in Voss's own office hand, and she needed something to set it against, that the company could not deny. And she did not see, for 2 more days, where such a thing could possibly still exist. It was the depot that gave it to her. In the end, the depot had been keeping it secret all along. She had been prying the last boards from the windows to let in light, and behind the order rack, where the hooped sticks hung on their pegs, she found the train order hook. Every station had one, a long spike of iron screwed to the wall on which the master impaled each order after it was executed, building over a day a sheaf of speared paper that was the station's true record of every movement in the original, as received and as run. At a busy junction, the hook was cleared and filed each week. At a dying station, at the end of a dead spur. In the last autumn, before the line closed, no one had ever come to clear it. The hook at Antler Gap still carried the last sheaf of orders, Obed Strawn had speared upon it 19 years before, brittle and brown and curled, but whole, the cold, dry air of the boarded room having kept them as the cold keeps everything it seals. She lifted the sheaf from the hook with both hands, the way you lift something that has been waiting, and carried it to the desk, and worked the orders apart one at a time with a watchmaker's patience, a graver's blade easing the brittle paper off the spike. And there, near the bottom, speared and executed and dated in the master's hand, were the genuine orders of that Thursday. The order that gave the down train the road from the division office at 1:30. The order that cleared it through Sable Tank without a stop, the arrival noted at 6. And there was no holding order among them. None. The order that Voss had later produced to the inquiry, the order that held the train 2 hours and manufactured the window, had never been issued to Antler Gap, had never come over the wire, had never been speared on the hook, because it had never existed until it was needed to hang 7 men. The forged order in the company file said the train was held. The true orders on the depot hook, in the master's hand, on the original brittle paper, said it ran straight through. The two could not both be true. And now, for the first time in 19 years, both could be set side by side, the company's lie and the station's truth, by anyone willing to read a clock and count 2 hours. She had the proof. She had the originals. The superintendent had been certain were rotted to dust behind condemned boards, in a building no one would ever buy, in a town the company had killed. He had scrubbed the office file and never thought to send a man to clear a hook at the end of a dead spur, because the spur was worthless, and the depot was worthless, and the woman who would one day pay $4 for it had not yet been born. Tamsen did not ride to a courthouse and accuse a powerful man. Obed had not raised her to accuse. She did the patient thing, the honest thing, the slow thing. She made a fair copy of the original orders in her own clear hand, and beside each she set the time, and she laid the copy against a tracing of the holding order's wording, as the old man and the records remembered it, and she wrote out, plainly and without heat, the simple arithmetic of the grade. That no locomotive of that road could run the 40 miles and the upper grade in 2 hours less than the cart allowed, so that a train both held 2 hours and arrived on time was an impossibility, and the impossibility was the whole case against the 7 men. Then she took the originals, the brittle speared orders themselves, and she did not give them to the company. She gave them to the Territorial Records Office at the county seat, a small dim room with a clerk who had no love for the cordage and Western, and she had them entered and sealed as found documents, witnessed, dated, and beyond the reach of any office that might wish them gone. She kept nothing back, and she claimed nothing for herself. She asked only that the entry note where the documents were found, and by whom, and what they showed. Calder Voss was an old man by then, retired to a stone house in the territorial capital, a pillar of the road he had served, his name on a division and a depot and a charitable fund. He had built a long life on the certainty that the worthless things he had buried would stay buried. We are permitted once to enter his thoughts, and only for a moment, and only because the loop requires it. When word reached him that the original orders from Antler Gap had surfaced, entered and sealed in the territorial record, he understood in a single cold instant that the one document he had never accounted for had outlived him, that a station master he had broken and a depot he had condemned had together kept the time he had tried to erase, and that there was nothing left in his long and careful life that he could do about it. He did not fight it. There was nothing to fight. The arithmetic was the arithmetic, and the paper was the paper, and the time, at last, was true. He died the following winter, and the obituaries were kind, because obituaries are. But the record beneath them no longer agreed with them, and would not, ever again. the territory did not put him on trial. He was too old, and the dead were too many years dead. The records office, however, presented with original documents it could not ignore, struck the finding of theft from the case of the 7 section men, and entered in its place that the charge had rested on a train order shown to be false, and that the men had been wrongly discharged and were cleared. It was a small, dry entry in a dim room. It was also the thing the old man in the dugout had wanted for 19 years, and had stopped believing he would ever have. Tamsin rode out to the Sable Tank Road to tell him herself. She did not make a speech of it. She told him plainly that the record now said his brother was no thief, that it was written and sealed and could not be unwritten, and that the lie had been lifted. The old man stood in his doorway in the cold spring light and did not weep, because men of his kind have forgotten how, but his hand went up and gripped the door frame, the way a man grips a thing to keep from falling, and he said his brother's name once. The way he had said it the first day, and this time it did not sound like a wound. It sounded like a man set down at last. He asked her what she wanted for it. She said she wanted nothing. She said the depot had kept it, not her, and that she had only read the clock. She found the families of the others over the following year, the way you find anything, patiently, by writing and asking and writing. Most of the 7 were dead. Some had left children, scattered down the river country and across the line into the next territory, grown now and carrying a name that had been spoiled before they were old enough to know why. To each of them, in time, came the same small, dry entry from the records office. The finding struck, the men cleared, and with it a short letter in a clear, upright hand, explaining where the proof had been found and what it had shown, signed by a woman they did not know, who asked nothing of them and never came to be thanked. The $11,000 was never recovered, and Tamsin did not pretend to know where it had gone. The express messenger, who had ridden the head end with the box that Thursday had died years before, and the seal had been sound, and the money had vanished somewhere between a sealed box and a forged order. Into the country of things the river of the railroad swallows and does not give back. She entered it as Obed would have, in the missing column of her own account, and let it stay there, because some of the missing stay missing, and an honest book records that too. She did not leave Antler Gap. There was no reason left to, and a reason to stay had grown up around her without her noticing. She kept the depot. She unboarded the rest of its windows and let the light into the dead room and made it a place again. She set up her bench beneath the regulator, and the people of the territory learned that the woman at the old depot could make a sick clock honest. And they brought her their regulators and their pocket watches and their grandfather's stop movements. And she cleaned the consciences of clocks for 200 miles around and set them true by the meridian line she had scratched on the south sill. The town that had laughed at her $4 coffin came one by one to need her, and the laughter was never spoken of again. And she never mentioned it, because Obed had also taught her that vindication that has to be said aloud is not vindication, but only noise. The regulator clock she never let run untrue again. It hung in its tall walnut case above her bench, the long pendulum swinging its even, incorruptible stroke, and she wound it herself every 8th day, easing the click the way it ought to be eased, and she kept it set to the sun. Travelers who passed through the dead spur to ask the way would sometimes notice it, an old railroad regulator, ticking in a depot where no train had run in a generation, and ask why a woman kept a station clock at a station with no trains. She would say only that it kept the time, and that someone had to. On the last evening of her first full year in the building, she opened the great black ledger again and turned past Obed's hand to the first blank page after his final entry, and she dipped her pen, and under the missing column, after 19 years, she wrote the word that closed it. Beside the strong box, found wanting. beside the 7 names found wronged and cleared. She blotted the page and let the ink dry and closed the book. And the only sound in the room was the regulator, counting off the honest seconds, one measured tooth at a time, the way a clock with a sound conscience keeps faith with you, long after the man who said it is gone. She left the brass key, worn smooth as a river stone, hanging on the peg by the door, where the next keeper of the time would find it. What would you have done if you had paid $4 for a thing the world had thrown away and found 7 names in it that someone needed cleared? Sit with that a while. And if a story of something dismissed turning out to hold the truth is the kind of thing you came here for, there are others like it waiting. And they keep, the way the cold keeps everything it seals, until you are ready to read them. The clock at Antler Gap is ticking still as far as anyone knows, and it tells the truth.